Growing up, I played a lot of N64 and PS1 games. From the simplistic visual style to the excellent storytelling, I've always adored games from the late 90s and early 2000s. So this is the start of my journey to make a game inspired by that era of games. Now, I watch a lot of devlogs on YouTube, a lot actually, and I see a lot of them start with pretty much them just diving into the engine and doing things. And actually, a lot of the developers I see are very programming heavy. I am quite the opposite. I'm going to be fairly heavy on the art side and fairly light on the programming side, but that's something I'm going to learn, and I want you all to come on this journey with me, because we're going to probably go through some struggles, have some teething issues, and things like that. It's going to be a fun devlog series, I think. And my promise to you all now is that I won't actually release a devlog unless I've finished another one. So if you're ever seeing this, and you're ever actually watching this and hearing me talk about this right now, it means devlog 2 is already done, and that one will come out when devlog 3 is done. Which I think, for me, is the most sensible way of doing things. So with that in mind, welcome to devlog 1 of Space 64. Yes, that's a working title. It's not actually going to be called Space 64, but I needed a name for the project, and that's what we're going to call it for now. And I think that works. So let's talk about the plan for devlog 1. It's all going to be pre-production, and we're going to do a little bit of production towards the end. We'll get there. But the main plan I want to share with you all today is my inspiration, my study of that inspiration, and what I want to take and what I want to replicate into my game, and then also the kind of the grander scope of where this game is going to go, the plans around that. So let's start with some of the inspiration and the games I went away and played, so that I got a feel for not only how these games looked back in the late 90s and early 2000s, but also how they played, everything from the character movement, the camera, the way enemies reacted, the way the world was laid out, everything like that. Level design, environment art, character art, everything, sound, all of it. I went away and I studied that, and I played a ton of games. I didn't really need to play some of them. I've played Ocarina of Time a billion times. But I went back, I played it. I love that game. And it's really interesting to look at it with more of a developer eye and try to learn what they did with the camera and the player movement, the targeting system, and all of that. Same goes for Majora's Mask. I ran around this starting area for a while because I really liked the moody jungle, foresty atmosphere of this area before you kind of fall into Termina. And I think this helps me a lot in terms of a visual cue for the first area we're going to build, but that's a devlog 2 problem, or thing to look forward to. Some of the games I went away and played are Jet Force Gemini. I think this is a really interesting one because it's a sci-fi game on the N64. Not a lot of sci-fi games, especially not adventure sci-fi games, that we can reference. And I think this was really useful for me to understand where we're going to take Space 64. I can't wait until it has an actual name, so I don't have to keep calling it that. But for now, it'll do. I think Jet Force Gemini was really important because of the way it handles shooting, and while our game will feature some ranged weaponry, it won't at the beginning. It's something you'll upgrade and unlock. So a lot of the early game is going to feature a sword and a shield, obviously much more sci-fi than you see in Zelda, but I think looking at how Jet Force Gemini does shooting, and another game we're going to get to in a second, and does ranged combat, I think is really interesting to learn from, and how they were still trying to figure out third-person aiming and third-person shooting back then, and we've come a long way since then. And I think that's something I just want to quickly talk about now is this isn't just going to look like an N64 game. It's going to have a lot of those limitations. It's going to be lower poly. It's going to adhere to a lot of triangle counts from back in the day, and it's also going to have very limited textures. They're going to often be 64 by 64 or 32 by 64, and so on and so on. And I think limiting myself on graphics will be really useful, and art, because it means I'll be able to iterate and make things quicker, so the actual process of building things out will be really fast. But it means that I can mix that with some slightly newer features, so it's not just gonna be a straight off, oh hey look, this is a N64 game. It's more like, hey, what could the N64 have become, or what could the PS1 have become? And that's kind of where my mindset is aiming for this. That sort of visual style, but maybe with more detailed shadows, or maybe with bloom, Stuff like that. Really simple things that we take for granted now, might make their way into the game. I don't know yet. We've never opened the engine that we're even making this game in. So this is still very early days. This is pre-production. We're just playing games and referencing things from there. Another game I played was Perfect Dark. I think Perfect Dark's interesting just to play from kind of that sci-fi-esque aesthetic and looking at the texture work and the detail you can get in a lot of that. The computer screens, the UI, things like that were really interesting and really important for me to just look at and take in as a piece of reference and to be inspired by, because that's what all these games are doing. Another game I played was Mega Man 64. I'd actually never played this one before. I think I maybe had played it on PS1 at some point, but this was the N64 version I played. And there's some really interesting visual cues in this game because it's more of like a anime cel-shaded sort of look to it. I think that was really interesting to look at how they did their world design and how they laid out their worlds in a much more linear way, but still open enough. The one game I actually didn't play myself, but there is a little bit of footage of here, is Body Harvest. I've actually played Body Harvest a few times, and I get to a certain point in it where I just always get really infuriated. It's after like the second or third boss. There's something about the N64 controls on some games just don't click for me. I can go and play Ocarina or Majora every day of the week, and those controls are just second nature to me. And I think that's something I'm going to take into this project, is Space 64, again, weird for me to say, is how does this going to feel to play? How is this going to control? And I think I'm going to lean closer to some of the, or a lot of the aspects of Ocarina and Majora with third-person aiming, which we'll talk about a little bit more in one of these further games you're going to see. Okay, I'll whiz through these next three. I played a lot more than these games I'm showing here. I played MKD, played Siphon Filter 2, Dino Crisis 2. I played a ton of games that I wanted to use as reference and to study, but I've just got 3 more on the N64 I want to talk about before we move into more things, or else this is just going to be a 10-minute long devlog of me showcasing N64 games, which is not what I want it to be. The next game I played was Sin and Punishment. This is an interesting one because it's an on-rails shooter, but it has a really fascinating art style to me. It's kind of more realistic anime, but there's a lot of really great details in the environment art, world design, character design that I really wanted to pay a lot of attention to. And again, another sci-fi game, useful to see how they approached a lot of these things for me. And it was also just really fun to play. Next, I actually booted up Star Wars Episode 1 Racer. I hadn't played this in years, but this was fun because you're going so fast through this open level on Tatooine, this pod racing track. I felt like this is interesting to see the level of detail they still managed to achieve, even though you're not really seeing it up close. You're whizzing past it so fast. And I can pause the screen at a few different times here. It looks like I've just frozen it, but you can see there's quite a lot of detail. And back then you don't have like big smears across the screen, there's no smearing over this way and that way with motion blur, nothing like that. Because for me, that's another thing of this era. Everything is so clean and sharp. Even though the N64 traditionally has, filters like this on it, and this is how you would probably see it on a screen, it's quite blurry. There's a lot of I guess it's like anti-aliasing, right, for the N64, while compared to the PS1 was a much sharper image and everything was kind of pixelated. Again, the N64 is using the bilinear filtering on the texture work, so I think there's a lot more blurriness to the N64. I quite like that. I think it ages a little better, personally, in my eyes, but each to their own. I still love the PS1 and a lot of games on the PS1. Spyro and Crash Bandicoot were games I grew up with as well. So the PS1's era and its visual style is still going to have an impact on this game, but a lot of the controls and feel of the game is going to be much closer to some of these classic N64 games. Okay, one final game I want to talk about. It's an unreleased N64 game called Dinosaur Planet. Now, Dinosaur Planet is a really interesting game because it got pretty far through development. It was kind of like a prototype that they pitched to Nintendo. I'm not really sure what happened then, but it eventually became Star Fox Adventures on the GameCube. Quite a different looking game. I mean, there's a lot of similarities in it, and you can compare the two and be like, oh, these look really similar. There's some exactly the same moments in it, but then there's also very different ones. And I actually went to play this for the first time. I've played Star Fox Adventures, but I hadn't played Dinosaur Planet before. And I realized very quickly how close to the Ocarina of Time Zelda sort of gameplay this mimics. When you first play as Crystal and you have this sort of staff weapon, there's some really cool dodge animations, there's some really cool lock-on animations, a lot of really cool elements to the combat, and the camera works the same, where you can press the trigger or the Z button to go back behind the camera. And then I realized there's also an aiming mechanic, and while I'm not a huge fan of how loose it feels, I feel like, okay, this is kind of how I want to do my aiming to a degree in Space 64. I think this is really a good reference point where, you know, the camera pulls behind the character and you do a little bit of sort of like overhead shooting, and then you can aim. You have a little reticle on the screen. I think that is the direction I want to go. But I think as well, Dinosaur Planet has a really great visual style for an N64 game. And I think I want to mix this with Jet Force Gemini and Ocarina of Time and Majora to kind of create my own sort of visual style and my own design language, rather than kind of dipping into the PS1 era too much. But I will borrow some things, and you'll see that as this devlog series goes on. And with that, I think I've talked enough about references and inspiration and N64 games and all of that. Again, I could go on about this for a very long time, but this is a devlog after all. I think it's time we start talking about the game. Now, I've done a lot of referencing, again, still pre-production here. I've done a lot of referencing of what I want this game to be and what I want this game to become in the long run. And I know the game's going to start with a cutscene, it's going to end with a cutscene. There's going to be 4 planets in between that. What I'm going to show you right now, what you're looking at, is my referencing for Planet 1. Now we're going to start developing some early stuff for Planet 1 in Devlog 2. We're going to build like a little prototype area where we can start building out a visual style, and we'll use it as almost like a test area for the character as we build that for probably a few devlogs where we'll be working on the character and fine-tuning it. And I think that's all going to be in Devlog 2, but you can see here I have a lot of really cool ideas for what I want to do with this first planet, and I've already kind of prepared a lot here. As you can see, this is, for me, a really important way of introducing you to this world, or these worlds that we're going to visit in this game. And the other thing that's really important as well is our character, our main character. Who do we play as? And that's where we got to this point, where I asked, well, 3, because I drew 1, 3 artists to draw artwork based on the same brief. So I basically gave them like a couple of days, gave them all the same amount of money, and I said, hey, go draw this. Here's the brief. It's an alien. It has 4 arms. He has 4 eyes, and he's an explorer. He's not really aggressive. He's just an explorer out there in a spacesuit doing his own thing. He's not looking to cause trouble. And I didn't show them my sketch. I did mine at the same time as them, and I'm not going to say whose is whose or point out which one is which, but you can see the 4 designs here, and I actually got a lot of really interesting responses from the ones that weren't mine. I was like, oh, okay, that's a good idea, that's a cool idea, and things like that. And that basically meant, okay, we have concept art for the character. It would be cool if we start prototyping this game with the first work-in-progress version of this character. I think, you know, we can tweak it and grow this character as development goes on, but let's learn on the job, basically. Let's build a character, as you can see right now. I'm using, scarily enough, I'm using a reference of Link from Ocarina of Time just to help me with proportions to start with. But what I did is I took Link and I gave him 2 more arms. It's terrifying to think about, but it was useful for me just to kind of look up triangle counts and figure things out a little bit at this stage, just to look at this weird 4-armed version of Link. Anyway, so I decided to model our main character here, and we can, like I said, we can evolve this character, give it new textures, tweak the model and things like that as time goes on. But I want to learn, and I want to fail, and I want to make mistakes using a real-world example, my model going into the engine and figuring things out. I feel like it would be a disservice to myself to try to learn on something that isn't this. I want to mess up. I want to learn using something that I've created rather than, a quick model I've grabbed off the internet or something like that, or even, Link from Ocarina of Time. I don't want to just use something existing. I think creating something ourselves is way more interesting going forward, and we can create something that will help us prototype. And that's what we're going to do next time as well. In Devlog 2, we're going to do the same for a little test environment. And it's almost like a test of my skills to prove that, I can do this N64 low poly style, but also, a way to visualize this game at an early stage I think is really important, because then we can grow it from there. And we have this little environment we can walk around and things like that. That'll be really cool. Here is the final character. Let me whiz forward a little bit. I textured him up, gave him, some cool textures, made him walk a little bit. I rigged him up, and then I did a few cool little poses for him, just so we can kind of get an idea of weaponry and how he's going to move and things like that. I think this is really important. These are almost like early concept key arts for the character. And this really leads me into the end of the first devlog. It doesn't feel like we've done that much. We've talked about N64 games for so long as inspiration, but like I said, this is pre-production. We've made a character which is kind of production, but again, I'm making it for this pre-production prototype that I want to build. And the main goal for this is going to be to build a player character with a camera system and a movement system and a combat system that feels somewhere between Ocarina of Time and Dinosaur Planet, with some inspiration from Jet Force Gemini sprinkled in there. That is the goal of the next few devlogs, I imagine, because I think next time what we're going to do is we are going to build a little test environment. We're going to build a little prototype testing area, and then we're going to import that and the character that you can see here on the screen. We're going to put those into the engine, and we are going to start building our game. What engine am I going to use? Well, I have a little bit of a history with one engine in particular, so I'm already familiar with one engine, that is the Unreal Engine. We're going to be using Unreal Engine 5, and that's a little bit of overkill for an N64 style game, but I think it'll be very fun to use. I've used it for a lot of cinematic things in the past. You can go back on the channel and find them, no doubt. I also quite like the flow between Blender to Unreal and back and forth. I feel like I understand that already. I haven't done it in a while. I've been tinkering with things over all these years. I was trying to recreate the Octopath Traveler style game where you go into houses and like your sprite shrinks down kind of thing. It's a really interesting system I actually got working through blueprints. And I think that's really important, that I've been doing these other gameplay things and I've been testing out tons of other game ideas. And I suppose that brings me to the final point of the devlog, which is next time we will move on to a little bit of a test environment design and figuring out some texture work for that and stuff. And then we're going to take that and the character into the Unreal Engine, and we're going to start very jankily moving this character around. But I think it's going to be one hell of a ride, because one day I'm going to look back at this devlog and I'm going to be like, holy shit, look where I started and look at this amazing game that came out of it. And with that, I'll see you all probably next month for Devlog 2. Hopefully you all subscribe and stay tuned for that. If you have any ideas or any just thoughts about what I've talked about in this video, the character, I'd love to hear what you all think about our main alien character, the four-armed blue fella that you've seen me create. And yeah, I want to hear about your thoughts on the inspiration as well, this sort of sci-fi Ocarina of Time-esque control system with elements of Jet Force Gemini and, some inspiration taken from the UI and systems of Perfect Dark and things like that. I want to hear what you think about that. And yeah, thank you for watching. Don't really know how to end these things. Let's just say goodbye.